You imagine your mum keeping that secret for such a long time?
50 years. My father never knew, nobody ever knew. Because if she'd have told my father, he would never have married her, I would imagine. Every older actor who gave me advice, 99% of them told me to give it up.
Almost everyone who shaped Michael Caine in old Hollywood is gone now. The men who taught him how to hold the screen, the friends who taught him how to survive fame, the people who took a chance on a working-class kid from South London when nobody else would. Most of them have already died. Caine, at 93, is one of the last people alive who actually lived through all of it. For decades, Caine avoided ranking anyone. Ask him who mattered most, and he'd deflect, list a dozen names, change the subject. But if you go back through 70 years of interviews, memoirs, and the handful of tributes he's written when his friends died, a pattern starts to show itself. There are 5 people Caine keeps returning to, again and again, in a way he doesn't return to anyone else. Not because he ever sat down and ranked them, he never did, but because of what he said about them when it counted, when there was no script and no publicist standing behind him. This is the story of those 5 people, and why, whether Caine ever admits it out loud or not, they're the ones who actually got through. It helps to remember what kind of career Caine actually had before we get into who mattered most inside it. This isn't a man who coasted through a handful of prestige pictures and called it a career. He worked constantly, in everything from war epics to gritty crime dramas to broad comedies, often taking roles purely because the paycheck let him support a growing family and later, keep his elderly mother comfortable. He said openly that for years he expected every job to be his last, a mindset left over from growing up poor in Rotherhithe and clawing his way into an industry that had no obvious use for someone with his accent. That hunger is part of why the relationships on this list matter so much. These weren't people Caine met once he was already secure. Several of them reached him at moments when he had every reason to expect the door to shut in his face, and instead it opened. Start with the one that surprises people, because Roger Moore and Michael Caine barely worked together. They weren't bound by some career-defining film the way Caine was with other names on this list. Their friendship came from somewhere older and less official, the London film and social scene of the 1960s and 70s, when a small circle of British actors were all clawing their way up at roughly the same time. Moore and Caine were an odd match on screen, if you think about it. Moore built a career on being smooth, unbothered, faintly amused by his own charm. Caine built his on being sharper and hungrier, an actor who always seemed to be one step ahead of the room. But off-screen, they ran in the same circles for decades, and by every account that's ever surfaced, the warmth between them was real and constant, not performed. You can see how real it was in how Caine reacted when Moore died in 2017. He didn't put out a measured, professional statement the way people expect from stars losing a colleague. He called Moore one of his oldest and closest friends and said, plainly, that his world would never be the same. That is not the language of someone managing an image. That's what a person says when they've actually lost someone. Look at where Caine's words sat next to everyone else's that day. Sean Connery mourned him. Bond producer Barbara Broccoli mourned him. Daniel Craig and Pierce Brosnan, the actors who inherited the role Moore made famous, both pay tribute. But most of those tributes read like what they were, statements from people honoring a colleague on a franchise they all shared. Caine's read differently. His sounded like grief, not etiquette. That's really the whole story with Moore. He wasn't a project Caine worked on. He was a person Caine had known since before either of them was anybody. And he was one of the very few people Caine could just be normal with, decades on, once the fame had swallowed almost everyone else they knew. There's something worth noticing in how differently Caine has talked about Moore compared to almost anyone else on this list. He rarely brings up a specific film, a specific set, a specific piece of professional history when Moore's name comes up. Instead, he talks about the era itself, long nights, shared circles. The strange experience of watching a friend become one of the most recognizable faces on the planet while you were becoming one yourself, on a completely different track. That kind of friendship is harder to point to than one built on a single project, but it might be the more durable kind. It's the difference between someone who shared a job with you and someone who shared a life running parallel to yours for 50 years. Moore falls firmly into the second category, And it shows in how raw Caine's reaction was when that parallel line finally ended. If Moore is the friend Caine leaned on, Laurence Olivier is something else entirely. The figure who told Caine, once and for all, that he'd earned his place. In 1972, Caine was cast opposite Olivier in Sleuth, a two-hander with no supporting cast to hide behind. No crew of characters to carry the weight if one actor faltered. It was just two men, one house, and 90 minutes of psychological chess. And Olivier wasn't just a respected actor. He was, by the early 70s, arguably the most decorated stage and screen performer Britain had ever produced. A knighted, mythologized figure whose reputation alone could rattle actors twice his size. Caine has said many times that walking into that shoot terrified him. This wasn't stranger, exactly. Olivier had introduced one of Caine's early television roles years before, and the two had crossed paths briefly on a wartime picture. But Sleuth was the first time they were actually asked to hold a film together, just the two of them, with nowhere to disappear. About a week into filming, Olivier said something to Caine that he has repeated for more than 50 years, because of what it meant to him. Olivier told him that when they started, he thought he'd been given an assistant. By that point in the shoot, he said, he realized he had a partner. Sit with what that actually is for a second. That's Laurence Olivier, a man other actors got nervous just standing near, telling a hairdresser's son from South London that he'd earned equal footing with him, on camera, in real time, with no room to fake it. Both men ended up nominated for the Academy Award for that performance. Neither one, Marlon Brando, took it that year for The Godfather. But by every account, the Oscar mattered far less to Caine than what Olivier had told him privately on set. That story has never once sounded rehearsed, even after 50 years of Caine telling it in interview after interview. It's always sounded like the exact moment he stopped feeling like an imposter. And it's clearly stayed with him. When Caine took on Olivier's old role in the 2007 remake of Sleuth opposite Jude Law, he insisted publicly that it wasn't a remake at all, because the production had commissioned an entirely new script from Harold Pinter rather than reusing Anthony Schaefer's original. It's a small detail, but it says something. Caine didn't want to be seen retreading something that had meant that much to him, not with the man who made it mean that much no longer there to weigh in. What makes the Olivier relationship different from everything else on this list is that it was never really built on ease. Caine has described rehearsals with Olivier as unpredictable, almost unsettling. Olivier would mumble through a scene quietly, giving nothing away, and then suddenly transform into what Caine has called an absolute giant of a performer, catching him completely off guard because he'd never done it that way in rehearsal. Caine has said you simply had to hang on and match him, take after take, never knowing which version of Olivier was going to show up. That's not the description of a comfortable friendship. It's a description of an apprenticeship, the kind where the lesson only sinks in because it's uncomfortable. And maybe that's exactly why the partner comment landed as hard as it did. It wasn't praise from someone trying to make Caine feel good. It was praise from someone who had spent a week making him earn it. Here's the relationship most people already sense, even if they've never thought about why. Sean Connery and Michael Caine starred together in The Man Who Would Be King in 1975, a film Caine has called his personal favorite of everything he's ever made. Not his biggest hit, not his most awarded, his favorite, out of more than 100 credits. The film itself almost didn't happen with either of them. Director John Huston had been trying to get it made since the 1950s, and over the decades he tried to cast it with pairs like Humphrey Bogart and Clark Gable, then Kirk Douglas and Burt Lancaster, then Paul Newman and Robert Redford. By most accounts, it was Newman himself who eventually pushed Huston toward Connery and Caine instead. Caine has said he always found that touching, that one of the biggest stars alive talked two working actors into a role that could have gone to almost anyone. What made the friendship last, though, wasn't the film. It was everything that came after it. When Connery died in 2020 at 90, Caine didn't write something careful and distant. He called him a great star, a brilliant actor, and a wonderful friend, and then added a line that only makes sense if you already know their movie together, a nod calling Connery the King, a callback to the film's title that read like an inside joke shared between two old friends, even in a moment of grief. There's a story from behind the scenes on that shoot that captures the friendship better than any public tribute could. During filming, the two actors had to cross a rope bridge for a scene, and Connery, who reportedly wasn't fond of heights, turned to Houston and asked if the bridge was safe. Houston, deadpan, told him it looked exactly the way it always had. The only thing different that day was that Connery would be the one standing in the middle of it. Caine has told that story for decades because it captures exactly what it was like being around the two of them. Real nerves, real trust, and constant, dry humor holding the whole thing together. Their friendship never curdled into the rivalry that so often develops between leading men of the same generation. Both had working-class roots. Both served in the military before acting. Both fought their way into an industry that wasn't handing out opportunities to people like them. That shared history seems to have built something that lasted the rest of Connery's life. Caine never talked about him as a distant legend, even decades later. He talked about him as someone whose loyalty and humor never changed, no matter how famous either of them got. It's also worth pointing out how unusual it was for two actors of that stature, from that same small pool of British talent, to never really compete with each other in the public imagination. Hollywood in the 60s and 70s loved pitting its leading men against one another, and Connery and Caine would have been an easy pair to frame that way. Both British, both self-made, both often up for similar kinds of roles. Instead, by every account from people who worked with them, they treated each other's success as something to celebrate rather than something to measure themselves against. That's a harder thing to sustain over 45 years than it sounds, and it's part of why Connery's death seemed to hit Caine harder than almost any other loss of his later years. Losing Connery didn't just mean losing a friend. It meant losing the one person who had walked essentially the same unlikely road as him, from the same unlikely starting point, the entire way. Not every relationship on this list needed decades to matter. This one started as a total accident in a hotel lobby, and Caine has told the story so many times, on talk shows on NPR, and in his own memoir, Blowing the Bloody Doors Off, that it's practically part of his official biography. Sometime in the mid-1960s, right after Zulu, The Ipcress File, and Alfie made him famous almost overnight, Caine was staying at the Beverly Hills Hotel, still new enough to Hollywood that he was watching for celebrities like anyone else. A helicopter landed outside. John Wayne stepped out, full cowboy hat, the genuine article. Wayne noticed him from across the lobby, walked over, and asked his name. When Caine told him, Wayne said he'd seen him in Alfie and told him flatly that he was going to be a star. Then, completely unprompted, he gave him two pieces of advice. The first was about acting itself. Talk low, talk slow, and don't say too much. Caine has called it the single most useful piece of acting advice he ever received, and he has repeated it almost word for word in interviews across more than 50 years. The second piece of advice is the one people remember, because it's absurd. Wayne looked down at Caine's shoes and told him to never wear suede. When Caine asked why, Wayne explained that once he was famous, sooner or later he'd be standing at a urinal. Someone would recognize him mid-conversation, and in their excitement they'd turn to shake his hand and ruin his shoes in the process. Caine has said, laughing, that he took the warning seriously enough to give away every pair of suede shoes he owned. It's a ridiculous story, but it's also revealing. Wayne barely knew him. He had nothing to gain by looking out for a young British actor he'd just met. And yet he did it twice, unprompted, in the space of one chance conversation, simply because he liked what he'd seen on screen. Caine has referred to him warmly ever since. And in his own memoir, he grouped Wayne alongside figures like Marlene Dietrich and Laurence Olivier as people whose words genuinely shaped how he approached his career. That's rare company for a 5-minute hotel lobby encounter. Caine has told this exact story, almost beat for beat, as recently as an appearance on The Graham Norton Show in 2018, the helicopter, the cowboy hat, the promise that he was going to be a star, the suede shoes. And it hasn't changed in any meaningful way across more than 5 decades of retellings. That consistency is its own kind of evidence. People embellish stories over time or let details drift, especially ones this old. Caine hasn't. He tells it the same way every time, which suggests it isn't a polished anecdote he's refined for effect. It's simply what happened, preserved almost exactly because of how much it meant to a young actor who, by his own admission, spent years genuinely unsure whether the next role would be his last. A stranger in a hotel lobby took 30 seconds to make him feel like he belonged in an industry that hadn't yet decided whether it wanted him. Apparently, that's the kind of thing you don't forget, no matter how famous you eventually become. The last name on this list might be the most important one, because without her, there's a real argument that Caine's American career never happens at all. In the mid-1960s, Shirley MacLaine, already one of the most powerful women in the industry, had approval rights over who would be cast opposite her in her next film, a heist comedy called Gambit. The studio screened her another director's recent film as a kind of audition. MacLaine wasn't sold on the director, but she noticed one of the actors in it, a young man in glasses named Michael Caine. She picked him for the lead on the spot without a script reading, without meeting him, on nothing more than what she'd seen on screen. Caine has said outright that this is how his Hollywood career began, and he's credited MacLaine's generosity specifically. After hearing endless stories about difficult, guarded stars, here was one of the biggest names in the business going out of her way for a complete unknown who had nothing to offer her in return. MacLaine, for her part, has told her own version of the story with just as much warmth over the years, describing how certain she was the moment she saw him, and joking that she's the one who's actually responsible for kicking off what became his long career. The timing made it even more remarkable. While Gambit was still shooting, Alfie was released back home in Britain and turned Caine into an overnight star there. So by the time Gambit reached American audiences, he wasn't a complete unknown anymore. But MacLaine had picked him before any of that happened, when there was nothing on paper to suggest it would work. Caine has admitted he'd have taken almost any part just to get a real foothold in American film. That's how much the opportunity meant to him at the time. The two of them worked together again decades later on the 2005 comedy Bewitched, and by all accounts the warmth between them hadn't dimmed a bit in the nearly 40 years between the two films. What sets MacLaine apart from everyone else on this list is that she's the only one who made a decision purely on faith. Moore's friendship grew slowly over years of shared circles. Olivier earned Caine's respect through a week of grueling, high-pressure filming. Connery and Caine built their bond through an actual shared project that both men fought to make happen. Wayne, at least, had seen Caine's performance in Alfie before he offered his advice. MacLaine, by contrast, made her decision off a few minutes of screen time in someone else's film, sight unseen beyond that, with nothing riding on it for her except her own judgment. She didn't need to take the risk. She had the leverage to cast anyone she wanted, and she spent it on an actor nobody in America had heard of yet. That kind of decision, made with nothing to gain and something real to lose if it went badly, is the closest thing to pure generosity on this entire list. And it's exactly the kind of thing Caine has never stopped being grateful for. Line all five up, and the pattern isn't what you'd expect. This isn't five actors from the same clique doing each other favors over the years. It's a knighted stage legend, a Bond actor who became a lifelong friend, a fellow working-class Brit who became his closest peer, an American Western icon who barely knew him, and a Hollywood powerhouse who bet on him before he'd proven anything at all. What connects them isn't genre or nationality or even timing. It's that every single one of them, in their own way, either handed Caine an opportunity he hadn't earned yet, or told him something honest that he needed to hear at exactly the right moment. That's arguably a far more telling definition of who someone actually loved than any tidy ranked list could ever give you. And it fits the whole shape of Caine's career, if you step back far enough. A Cockney kid from Rotherhithe who left school at 15, went through national service, and somehow ended up trading loyalty, advice, and genuine affection with some of the most famous people of the 20th century. He said many times that he never brings a role home with him, that acting is just a job to him, ruthlessly professional. But the way he talks about these five people tells a different story entirely. These weren't colleagues he was polite to. These were the people who actually built him. Michael Caine has never sat down and handed anyone a neat, official list of who mattered most to him. He probably never will. But the names that keep surfacing unprompted across 70 years of interviews, memoirs, and tributes are the ones that earned it. One story, one piece of advice, one moment of honesty at a time. At 93, With almost everyone on this list already gone, Caine is one of the last people left who can still tell these stories in his own voice, which is exactly why they're worth listening to while he's still here to tell them.